Real-life horror stories that will haunt your every move. Be advised, it's so terrifying that 90% of people couldn't last more than 30 minutes before shutting it off. Consider this your only warning.
Part 1. The First Animal. Out in western Kansas, the land is flat enough to make you feel exposed. Not watched, exposed. There's a difference. On flat land, there's nowhere for anything to hide, which means if something is hiding, it's not doing it the way you think. The Miller farm had been in the family for 4 generations. 2,000 acres of dry grass, fencing, and slow-moving cattle that grazed under a sky so wide it made you feel smaller than you were. Tom Miller didn't believe in superstition. He believed in drought cycles, market fluctuations, predators, broken fencing, and hard work. That changed the morning he found cow number 317. It wasn't torn apart. It wasn't half-eaten. There was no blood. That's what bothered him. The animal lay on its side in the pasture, legs stiff, eyes open. No visible wounds, no bite marks, no punctures, just empty. Tom crouched beside it. The body felt wrong, not just cold, light. He frowned and pressed down on its ribcage. There was resistance, but something about the weight felt off, as if something inside the animal wasn't there anymore. He stood and scanned the horizon. Coyotes would have left marks. Mountain lions didn't hunt this far out, and even if they did, they left mess. This wasn't mess. This was absence. By noon, 3 more cattle were found in separate sections of the pasture, all the same. No trauma, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just stiff bodies, eyes open, mouths slightly parted. Tom called the county vet. The vet arrived around 3 p.m., sweating under the Kansas sun. He cut one open. No blood pooled, no organ damage, but when he reached into the cavity, he froze. The organs were intact, but desiccated, as if something had passed through them, not eaten, not removed, passed through. The vet swallowed. "I've never seen anything like this." Tom didn't answer. He was looking at the ground. There were no tracks, no disturbed soil, no drag marks, nothing. 4 animals dead, and not a single sign that anything had been there. That night, the wind died completely. The farm dogs refused to leave the porch. Tom's teenage son Caleb mentioned something at dinner. The cows were standing weird before sunset. Tom looked up. "What do you mean?" They were all facing the same direction. Toward what? Caleb hesitated. The north fence. Tom frowned. There was nothing north of the property except more empty land. No houses.
No barns. No tree lines. Just fields stretching toward the horizon. "Animals do that sometimes," Tom muttered. But Caleb shook his head slowly. They weren't grazing. They were just standing there. At 2:13 a.m., the motion lights outside the barn flicked on. Tom woke immediately. He didn't grab a gun. He grabbed a flashlight. Because again, he didn't believe in monsters. He believed in problems, and problems had solutions. He stepped out onto the porch. The air felt different, not colder, thicker. The motion light cast long shadows across the barn wall. Nothing moved. The wind was gone, completely gone. The silence pressed in hard. Tom started walking toward the barn. Halfway there, he heard it. Not a growl, not a howl. Breathing, deep, slow, and layered, not from one direction, from everywhere. He stopped. The breathing continued. Then, from inside the barn, a soft thud, like something heavy shifting its weight. Tom moved faster now. He swung open the barn door. The cows inside were still, too still. Every single one of them stood facing the back wall, heads angled slightly upward, eyes fixed, on nothing. Tom followed their gaze. The back wall looked normal. Wood paneling, support beams, tools hanging where they always hung, but the shadows on the wall didn't match the light source. They stretched vertically, longer than the objects casting them. Tom felt something in his chest tighten. He stepped closer. The breathing stopped. Instantly, total silence. The cows blinked.
shook their heads, began shifting normally again, lowing softly, as if waking from something. Tom stood there for a long time. The barn looked normal, the wall looked normal, the shadows returned to proportion, but the air still felt wrong, like something had just stepped backward, into a place he couldn't see. The next morning, 7 more cattle were dead, not in the pasture, inside the barn, standing upright, propped against the back wall, as if held there, eyes open, no blood, no trauma, no sound heard during the night. And this time, there was something new. On the inside of the barn wall, a faint vertical mark, not scratched, not carved, indented, as if something had pressed itself there from the other side. Tom ran his hand over it. The wood felt cold, colder than it should have been in the Kansas heat. Behind that wall was open land, nothing else, no structure, no building.
And sky. Tom stood there, staring at that mark, and for the first time in his life, he felt watched. Not from the field, not from the road, from somewhere close, somewhere that didn't require space to stand. That night, all the cattle in the north pasture stood again, facing the fence, perfectly still, and beyond that fence, something tall shifted against the horizon, not walking, not running, just adjusting its posture.
Part 2. What the fence was for. Tom didn't sleep the second night. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing down times. 2:13 a.m., motion light. 2:17 a.m., barn breathing. Sunrise, 7 dead inside. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but he believed in patterns, and something was operating on one. The sheriff came out the next morning, walked the pasture, examined the barn, listened without interrupting. Any signs of trespassing? The sheriff asked. No, Tom replied. Any enemies? No. The sheriff squinted toward the north fence. You're sure nothing's out there? Tom nodded. Nothing but empty land. That wasn't entirely true. There was something out there now. He just didn't have words for it. Caleb installed trail cameras along the north fence that afternoon, 6 of them, battery-powered, motion-activated. If anything crossed that property line, they'd see it. Tom didn't tell his son this, but the fence suddenly felt less like protection and more like containment. That evening, the cattle refused to graze near the north side. They clustered together 50 yards back, watching. Not the sky, not the ground, the fence. Tom followed their gaze. Nothing visible, just posts and wire stretching across the field, wind brushing dry grass. Normal, but the animals knew something wasn't. At 8:47 p.m., all of them moved in unison, 3 slow steps backward, like something had stepped forward. At 1:02 a.m., the barn light flicked on again. Tom was already awake. This time Caleb was too. I'm coming with you, his son said quietly. Tom hesitated, then nodded. They walked out together. The air felt thick again, not humid, heavy, as if sound had weight. Halfway to the barn, Caleb stopped. Dad. Tom turned. Caleb was staring at the north pasture. Tom followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he saw what the cattle had been reacting to. Not movement, absence. A section of sky near the horizon looked wrong. Not darker, not lighter, flattened, like depth had been reduced in that specific area. Tom's brain tried to correct it. Cloud cover, heat shimmer, optical illusion. But the longer he stared, the more it felt like something tall was standing there, perfectly still, blocking space itself. Then, the barn door creaked open behind them. They both spun around. The door hadn't just opened. It had been pushed from the inside.
Tom rest forward, yanked the door wide. The interior was dim. The cows inside were packed tight against the far wall, not facing it this time, pressing away from it, eyes wide, nostrils flared, terrified. The breathing started again, not outside, not in the field, inside the barn walls, deep, layered, too large for lungs. Caleb whispered. "It's in here." Tom's flashlight beam moved slowly along the back wall and stopped. The vertical indentation in the wood had deepened. It wasn't faint anymore. It was pronounced, nearly 7 feet tall, narrow, like the outline of something that had leaned there repeatedly, pressing, testing. The breathing grew louder. The wood paneling bowed inward slightly, just a fraction. Tom stepped back instinctively. The cows began lowing in panic. One kicked the stall gate. Metal clanged sharply. And for one split second, the wood split, not cracked, opened. A thin vertical seam in the wall, black beyond it. Not darkness, blackness, total absence. And inside that seam, something moved, not stepping through, adjusting, like something trying to understand angles. Tom grabbed Caleb's shoulder. Out. They backed toward the door, slow. The seam widened another inch. The breathing synchronized with the cow's panicked breaths. And then, everything stopped. The seam sealed instantly. The wall returned to normal. The indentation remained, but the wood was solid again. The cows collapsed to their knees, shaking. Tom slammed the barn door shut, locked it, though he knew locks were meaningless. Inside the house, they checked the trail cameras immediately. Footage from 12:59 a.m. to 1:04 a.m. was corrupted. Not static, not distortion, just missing. Skipped frames, like 5 minutes had never been recorded. But something else stood out. In the frame before the gap, the north fence was visible. In the frame after, the fence looked slightly closer, by maybe a foot. Tom frowned. That's not passable. Caleb zoomed in. Fence posts were slightly out of alignment with earlier shots. Not broken, not moved, just shifted, inward. The next morning, they walked the fence line. Every post on the north side had sunk deeper into the ground, not by much, half an inch, but uniformly, as if something heavy had leaned against it from the inside. Tom's stomach tightened. From the inside, not outside the property. Inside.
The fence wasn't keeping something out. It was marking a boundary. And something inside that boundary was growing. By noon, 3 cattle were missing. Not dead, gone. No blood, no tracks, no broken fencing. Just empty space in the pasture where they had stood hours before. Tom checked the barn, counted twice, still missing. Caleb's voice was tight. Maybe they broke through somewhere. Tom shook his head slowly. No. He looked toward the north field. The section of sky still felt flattened, closer now. The fence line felt narrower, the pasture smaller, as if the land itself was compressing slightly each night. That afternoon, Tom made a call he never thought he'd make. He contacted a neighboring farmer 10 miles east, asked if he'd noticed anything strange. Long silence on the line. Then, "You too?" Tom's pulse quickened. "What happened?" "2 cows missing last week. No tracks. And my north fence bowed inward." Tom's mouth went dry. "How far north is your property line?" "North." Tom stared at the horizon, the flattened patch of sky, the subtle distortion. It wasn't just on his land. It was moving. Not across the ground, through it, expanding from somewhere unseen. That night, all the cattle gathered at the south end of the pasture, far from the fence, huddled tightly, silent. No grazing, no shifting, just watching. The fence creaked, slowly. One post tilted inward another inch, then another. No visible force pushing it, just steady pressure. The sky above the fence seemed to lower slightly, as if something tall had bent forward. Tom stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, knowing it would do nothing. He could feel it now. The farm wasn't being attacked. It was being narrowed, compressed. Each night the north boundary moved. Each night space decreased. And whatever stood beyond the fence wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to make less room for everything else. At 2:13 a.m., the motion lights didn't flick on. They exploded. Glass shattered. Bulbs burst simultaneously. The yard went dark. In that darkness, Tom heard it clearly. A step. Not on dirt. Not on grass. On wood. From inside the barn.
Part 3. The space between. When the motion lights exploded, Tom didn't flinch. He had grown up around gunfire, lightning strikes, transformers blowing in summer storms. But this wasn't electrical. All 3 bulbs burst at the exact same time. Not flickered, not shorted, burst. The yard dropped into blackness so complete it felt physical. For a second, neither Tom nor Caleb moved. Then they both heard it. A step. Slow. Deliberate. Inside the barn. Not hooves. Not scrambling. A single weighted shift. Wood under pressure. Tom racked the shotgun. The sound felt too small for the moment. "Stay behind me," he said. Caleb didn't argue. They crossed the yard with flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. The air pressure felt wrong again. Not windless this time. Compressed. Like the atmosphere itself had tightened around the property. Tom reached the barn door. It was slightly ajar. He was certain he had latched it. He pushed it open slowly. The beam of his flashlight swept across the interior. Stalls. Feed bins. The side wall. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Then he noticed the cattle. They were not panicking. They were not pressing against the back wall. They were spaced out evenly across the barn, perfectly still. Heads turned, not toward the wall, but toward the center aisle, toward something that was not visible. Tom's pulse thudded in his ears. The beam of light trembled slightly as he moved it down the aisle. Nothing. Just dust particles suspended in air. Except the dust wasn't falling. It was drifting sideways, inward, toward the center, as if gravity had shifted subtly. Tom stepped forward. One slow step. The floor creaked beneath him, and something responded. Not a sound, a pressure change. The air tightened. Caleb whispered behind him, "Dad." Tom didn't turn. He felt it now. The space in the center aisle felt thinner, not visually, not like a distortion, but like the distance between objects had shortened. He raised the flashlight and pointed it straight ahead. The far wall of the barn looked closer than it should have been. The aisle had always been about 30 feet long. It now looked 25. No bending, no obvious shift, just less distance. Caleb inhaled sharply. The barn's smaller. Tom swallowed. That's not possible. But he knew it was. He could feel it in his bones. The cows began to shift uneasily. One let out a low,
Trembling sound. The dust in the beam thickened. And then, the center of the aisle darkened. Not like a shadow passing, like depth itself collapsed. A vertical seam appeared midair. Not on a wall, not touching anything, just suspended. 7 feet tall, barely wider than a crack in drywall. Black beyond it. That same blackness from before. Total absence. The seam pulsed once. The cows' heads tilted in unison, not toward it, away from it. Tom grabbed Caleb's arm. "We're leaving." As they stepped backward, the seam widened. Not fast, not violently, but steadily, as if something on the other side had leaned forward. Tom felt his ears pop. The pressure increased. The barn groaned softly. Wood beams creaked under stress that wasn't structural. It was spatial. The seam reached maybe 3 inches wide. Inside it, there was no shape, no creature, but there was depth and movement within that depth, not coming out, adjusting, studying. Tom did something irrational then. He raised the shotgun and fired directly into the seam. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. The muzzle flash illuminated the interior of the crack for half a second. What he saw was not a body, not flesh, not limbs. He saw angles that did not belong in 3-dimensional space, planes intersecting incorrectly, surfaces folding inward, like geometry collapsing in on itself. Then the seam snapped shut. Instantly, the pressure vanished. The barn expanded back to normal length. Dust fell to the ground. The cows collapsed onto their knees, shaking. Caleb's breathing came in ragged bursts. "Did you see that?" Tom didn't answer. He couldn't, because he had, and he didn't have language for it. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, they walked the pasture. 3 more cattle were gone. Not dead,
Gone. No bodies. No sign of struggle. Just empty patches of grass where they should have been. Tom counted twice, then 3 times. 15 missing in total now. The sheriff came again, listened again, looked more uneasy this time. "You're telling me space is shrinking?" he asked carefully. Tom didn't react to the skepticism. He simply walked him into the barn, measured the aisle, 30 feet, then showed him last year's insurance photo from his phone. The aisle in the photo measured 34. The sheriff frowned. That could be lens distortion.
Tom handed him a tape measure. They measured the exterior length of the barn, same as before, but the interior space was 4 feet shorter. The walls hadn't moved. The outside dimensions hadn't changed, but inside, there was less room. The sheriff went quiet after that. By afternoon, word had spread to neighboring farms. 2 more reported missing livestock. One mentioned something else. Fence posts on the north boundary had begun sinking, uniformly, like Tom's. That night, Tom and Caleb set up a fixed camera inside the barn, not motion activated, continuous recording. They set up portable floodlights powered by a generator. If the seam appeared again, they would capture it. They parked the truck near the barn and left the engine running, headlights aimed directly at the doors. If space was going to collapse, they would see it. Midnight passed without incident. 1 a.m., 1:45. At 2:11 a.m., the truck's engine stalled. No warning, just died. The floodlights flickered, then steadied. Caleb stared at the barn monitor in the truck cab. "Dad." Tom looked. The barn interior on the screen looked wrong. The cows were visible, but the depth of the aisle was shorter than it had been even that afternoon. The seam hadn't appeared yet, but the space was already compressing. On camera, without darkness, without pressure changes, just reducing. The far wall seemed to drift closer by inches. Caleb's voice shook. "It's not hunting the cows." Tom felt a cold understanding settle in his chest. "No." The floodlights flickered again. Inside the barn, the seam appeared, this time larger, wider than before. And the cows did not panic. They did not run. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting. Tom grabbed the door handle. Caleb caught his arm. "Don't." Tom hesitated. On the monitor, one cow near the center aisle began to blur. Not vanish, not step forward, blur, as if its edges were being erased. The seam pulsed. The cow's body compressed vertically, not crushed, flattened, reduced. Its form narrowed, and then it was gone. No blood, no sound, no collapse, just absence. The seam narrowed slightly, as if satisfied. Caleb whispered, "It's not taking them." Tom's jaw clenched. "It's taking room." He understood now. The cattle weren't being hunted, they were being used. Each disappearance coincided with a reduction in interior space. The entity wasn't feeding on flesh.
It was feeding on dimensional volume, on space itself. The more living mass within a boundary, the more space existed, and it was consuming that. The fence line, the barn interior, the pasture, all slowly shrinking. The seam widened again. Another cow blurred. This time Tom couldn't stay still. He burst from the truck and sprinted towards the barn. Caleb shouted after him. The floodlights flickered violently. The barn doors slammed shut before Tom reached them. He grabbed the handle, pulled, locked, from the inside. The monitor in the truck showed the interior view. 2 more cows vanished. The aisle shortened further, the far wall now only 15 feet from the camera. The seam pulsed one final time, then closed. The floodlights went out. Total darkness. Tom stood outside the barn, breathing hard. The air pressure normalized slowly. After a full minute, the doors unlocked, on their own. He opened them cautiously. Inside, 10 cattle remained. The barn aisle now measured 18 feet, from 34. In 2 nights, Tom stepped backward slowly. The barn felt claustrophobic, not because of walls, but because of what wasn't there anymore. Caleb joined him, voice barely audible. "If it keeps going," Tom finished the thought, "there won't be any space left." They both looked towards the north fence. It had tilted another inch inward. The horizon looked closer than it had yesterday. The stars above that section seemed slightly displaced, not shifted, compressed. Tom understood something then that chilled him more than anything else. The entity wasn't expanding from outside. It wasn't crossing the fence. The fence marked the edge of its territory, and that territory was getting smaller.
which meant they were inside it, and it was collapsing inward, not to escape, not to attack, but to reduce, to eliminate excess dimension. And when the cattle were gone, there would still be space left, enough for a house, a barn, 2 people. Tom looked at his son. For the first time, real fear replaced confusion. It's not done. At sunrise, they walked the north boundary again. The fence now leaned visibly. Beyond it, the land looked closer, the horizon unnaturally near, like a backdrop in a theater set. Caleb stopped walking. Dad. Tom followed his gaze. Far out in the north field, something tall adjusted its posture against the flattened sky. Not stepping, not approaching, just.
As space diminished, the less room there was, the more defined it appeared. Part 4. The First Reduction. By the 4th morning, the land didn't feel like land anymore. It felt staged, like a photograph stretched over something shallow. Tom stood at the north fence at dawn, boots pressed into soil that no longer felt as deep as it should. When he drove the heel down, the resistance came too quickly, like bedrock was only inches below the surface. Caleb noticed it too. Dad, the ground's thinner. Tom didn't answer right away. He crouched and drove a metal fence probe into the dirt. It usually sank nearly 2 feet before hitting compact clay. This time it stopped at 8 inches. Solid. He pulled it out slowly. The soil wasn't different. It was just less. Behind them, the barn stood where it always had. But it looked closer to the house than it had yesterday. They hadn't moved. Nothing had been bulldozed, yet the distance between structures felt reduced. Not visually obvious, but wrong in the body. Like walking inside a room with low ceilings. The sheriff returned that afternoon. Not alone this time. He brought a surveyor. They measured property lines against old county records. On paper, the Miller farm still spanned 2,000 acres. In reality, it didn't. GPS coordinates drifted. The north boundary line now sat nearly 30 yards south of where official maps placed it. Not broken fencing, not trespass. The land itself had shifted inward. The surveyor ran his equipment 3 times. Each reading confirmed the same impossible truth. The farm was shrinking. The sheriff looked pale. Is this happening anywhere else? Tom nodded. 3 neighbors called yesterday. They drove east to check. The Johnson farm, 10 miles away, looked abandoned. No vehicles, no livestock. The house stood intact. But the barn was gone. Not burned, not collapsed. Gone. In its place, a shallow depression in the earth. Perfectly rectangular. The shape of something that had once occupied space. The sheriff swallowed hard. They approached the house cautiously. Front door unlocked. Interior fully furnished. Coffee mug on the table. TV remote on the couch. No signs of struggle. No blood. No bodies. Just absence. The hallway felt narrow. Tom remembered this house. He'd walked through it years ago. It used to feel wide. Now the corridor brushed his shoulders. The living room measured 12 feet across. It had been at least 18. On the far wall, a faint vertical indentation. 7 feet tall. Caleb stared at it. It's not random. Tom nodded slowly. It consumes enclosed space.
The sheriff looked between them. Consumes how? Tom didn't answer. He didn't know the mechanism, but he knew the pattern. Anything within defined boundaries, barns, houses, fenced land, was being compressed, reduced, absorbed. That night, they didn't wait inside the truck. They stood outside the barn before midnight, floodlights ready, generator running. Tom had made a decision. If it was consuming enclosed space, they would remove enclosure. He and Caleb had torn down half the north fence that afternoon, posts uprooted, wire cut, open field beyond. If there was no boundary, maybe there was no territory. Midnight passed. The air thickened again. 1:37 a.m., the floodlights flickered. Tom kept his eyes fixed on the barn doors. At 2:11 a.m., the ground beneath their boots shifted, not shaking, sliding, inward, like the earth itself had exhaled and contracted. The barn doors bowed inward slightly. Caleb stepped back. Dad, the seam didn't appear inside the barn this time. It appeared in the open field, where the fence had been removed, suspended midair, wider than before, at least 2 feet across, blackness pulsing within. Tom felt pressure in his skull. A low-frequency hum vibrated through his chest. The cattle inside the barn collapsed to their knees instantly, not panicking, submitting. The seam tilted slightly, not forward, sideways, as if adjusting perspective. The floodlights exploded again. Darkness swallowed the yard. Only moonlight remained, and the seam glowed faintly against the horizon. Then, it moved, not stepping, sliding, toward the house. Tom felt cold terror spike through him. It doesn't need the fence, Caleb whispered. No, the fence had never contained it. It had defined it, and now that boundary was gone, it was redrawing one. Closer. The seam stopped 15 yards from the porch. Air pressure intensified. The house windows rattled. Tom grabbed Caleb's arm. Inside. They rushed up the steps. The front door slammed shut behind them on its own. The hallway instantly felt narrower, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. Caleb spun in panic. It's in here. Tom's ears popped painfully. The house groaned softly. Wood beams bending under stress that wasn't structural. It was spatial compression. The living room shortened visibly.
Furniture shifted closer together without sliding. Just less distance between them. Tom grabbed Caleb and pulled him toward the back door. It wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door didn't move, as if there was no longer enough space for it to swing. The air grew heavy. Breathing felt thick. The hallway began narrowing, drywall cracking softly. A vertical seam formed at the far end, larger than ever before, nearly ceiling to floor. The blackness inside pulsed slowly, and something inside it adjusted, not stepping out, leaning, studying. Tom felt a sudden, overwhelming understanding. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't angry. It was efficient, reducing unnecessary volume, correcting excess. The house had too much room. The farm had too much land. The world had too much space, and it was simplifying. Caleb staggered. Dad, I can't. The ceiling lowered another inch. Tom shoved him toward the kitchen. Garage. They ran. The garage door opener didn't respond. Manual release jammed. The scene pulsed again. The kitchen table narrowed. The refrigerator shifted inches closer to the counter without moving. Tom realized something terrifying. Open space slowed it, and closed space accelerated it. The garage was enclosed. He changed direction. Back outside. They sprinted toward the front door. It opened easily. The second they stepped onto the porch, the pressure eased slightly. The house behind them groaned violently. Windows shattered inward. The roofline dipped half a foot. The seam inside flared. And then, the entire structure compressed, not collapsing, not exploding, shrinking. Like a cardboard box crushed slowly by invisible hands. Walls folded inward without debris flying. Glass didn't scatter. It folded into itself. Within 10 seconds, the house was half its original width. Within 20, it was gone. In its place, a shallow rectangular depression in the dirt, perfectly clean. Tom and Caleb stood in the yard, breathing hard. The seam hovered above where the living room had been. It pulsed once more, then narrowed, and vanished. The yard felt wider suddenly, because there was less in it. The barn now stood alone, closer to them than it had ever been. Caleb's voice trembled. It took the house.
Tom nodded slowly. It took the space. They turned toward the north horizon. The tall distortion was clearer now, defined edges against the sky. Not a creature, not a body.
But a vertical presence. The less room existed, the more distinct it became. It was not coming from somewhere else. It was being revealed as volume disappeared. Dawn came pale and cold. The Miller farmhouse no longer existed. Neither did the Johnson farm to the east. A distant column of dust rose on the horizon where another property had once been. Tom's phone had no signal. The road leading south looked closer than it should. Caleb walked toward it, counted steps. It's shorter. Tom didn't doubt him. The entire region was compressing. Enclosed structures first, then land, then... what? He looked at his son. If the pattern continued, the barn would go next, then the yard, then whatever space remained around them. And once there was no more enclosed space, it would begin reducing open field until there was no volume left at all. Just a plain, just surface, just nothing. Caleb looked up at him. What do we do? Tom stared at the horizon where the vertical distortion stood clearer than ever. He finally understood the rule. It wasn't random. It wasn't feeding on life. It was eliminating three-dimensional depth, collapsing space toward flatness, and they were inside its boundary. He exhaled slowly. We stop and closing anything. Caleb frowned. What? We don't let it define space. He looked toward the barn, then toward the remaining fencing. If it needs boundaries to consume volume, his voice hardened, then we remove all of them. The wind finally returned. Light, uneasy, but moving. Far out on the horizon, the tall presence adjusted slightly, as if listening.
Part 5. The Man Who Became Less. By the 5th day, maps were useless. Tom spread 3 of them across the hood of his truck at sunrise: an old county survey map, a recent satellite printout, and the GPS grid the sheriff had printed from his cruiser. All 3 agreed on paper. None of them matched what stood in front of him. The Miller barn was now less than 40 yards from where the house had once been. That distance used to be nearly 100. The South Road, County Route 18, should have been a quarter mile from the porch. Now it looked close enough to hit with a rock. Caleb stood beside him, staring at the horizon. "It's pulling everything inward," he said quietly. Tom nodded. Not dragging, not shifting, compressing, like someone pressing a massive thumb down on a model landscape. The sheriff arrived before noon. He didn't bring the surveyor this time. He brought a state trooper. The trooper stepped out of his cruiser and froze halfway across the yard. He didn't need explanation. He could see it. The barn sat unnaturally close. The pasture felt shallow. Even the sky looked lower. They measured the road. What had once been 0.25 miles now measured 0.14. No debris, no construction, no visible earthwork, just less distance. The trooper spoke first. "We've lost 3 properties west of here." "Lost how?" Tom asked. The trooper hesitated. "They're not there." Tom felt no surprise. "Depressions." The trooper stared at him. "How did you?" Tom didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, news crackled over the radio. 2 counties north reported infrastructure anomalies. A grain silo had collapsed without debris. A water tower was reported missing. Road signs were appearing closer together than standard spacing. The phenomenon wasn't isolated to the farm anymore. It was regional, but it was strongest here, centered here. Caleb walked the perimeter where the fence had been removed. He stopped suddenly. "Dad," Tom joined him. Where the fence line had once run, the ground showed a faint rectangular discoloration, like the ghost of a boundary. Even though they had torn it down, the outline remained. Tom's stomach turned. "It remembers," whispered Caleb. "Yes, the entity didn't need physical fences. It responded to defined space. The barn, the house, property lines, even invisible ones. Anything humans designate as contained. And now, it was shrinking the container itself. That evening,
The sheriff insisted they evacuate. "We'll head south," he said. "Get beyond the county line."
Tom agreed. They packed what they could into the truck: clothes, water, fuel cans, shotgun. Before leaving, Tom turned toward the barn. Only 8 cattle remained. He opened the doors wide. "Go," he muttered. The animals didn't hesitate. They bolted into the open pasture. No enclosure, no stalls, no defined boundary, just field. Tom hoped maybe that would spare them. They climbed into the truck. The sheriff's cruiser pulled ahead. The state trooper followed behind. 3 vehicles heading south. The road felt narrower than before. Not visually, physically, as if the lanes had tightened. They drove in silence for 10 minutes. Then Caleb looked at the GPS. It's recalculating. The sheriff's voice crackled over the radio. Route's shorter than it should be. Tom's pulse quickened. How much shorter? About half. Tom's grip tightened on the wheel. The road ahead appeared normal. Fields on both sides. Telephone poles spaced evenly. Except the poles were closer together. He knew they were. He'd driven this road his entire life. The truck began to vibrate faintly. Not mechanical, atmospheric. The air pressure was increasing again. "Don't stop," the trooper's voice came over the radio. They rounded a bend and froze. The road ended. Not blocked. Ended. As if someone had erased the next half mile. Where pavement should have stretched into the horizon, there was flat earth. No rubble. No torn asphalt. Just open dirt. Compressed. The sheriff slammed on his brakes. Tom stopped behind him. The trooper stepped out slowly, stared at the missing stretch. Jesus. The air grew heavy. The sky ahead flattened. And then they saw it. Far beyond where the road had once continued. The vertical distortion. Taller now. Clearer. Defined against the sky like a massive upright tear. Not approaching. Just revealed more fully as depth diminished. Caleb whispered, "It's ahead of us." Tom understood. They hadn't been driving away from it. They had been driving deeper into its territory. The region was collapsing inward. Toward that point, the trooper began backing up slowly. The sheriff did the same. Tom followed. The moment they reversed, the road behind them shortened, not vanished, compressed, like the space they'd just driven through had been squeezed out. Caleb looked back through the rear window. "Dad, it's closing!" Tom slammed the truck into drive and accelerated toward a side gravel road. Maybe lateral movement would work. Maybe moving perpendicular to the compression line would buy distance. They turned sharply. Gravel sprayed. The truck bounced. For a moment, it felt normal. Then the truck jerked violently, like it had hit an invisible wall. Tom slammed the brakes. They weren't stopped by impact. They were stopped by lack of space. The gravel road ahead had shortened to maybe 30 feet. Beyond that, nothing. Flat dirt. Compressed. The sheriff stepped out again, walked forward cautiously. He extended his hand into empty air. His palm met resistance. Not a surface. Pressure. He pushed slightly. The air rippled, like heat distortion. And then, the seam appeared directly in front of him, wider than ever before, nearly 4 feet across. The sheriff stumbled backward. The blackness inside churned, not violently, deliberately. Tom stepped out of the truck. Caleb followed despite his father's shout to stay inside. The seam tilted slightly, aligning with the sheriff. The air grew crushingly heavy. The trooper raised his pistol and fired into it. The shots made no sound beyond the gun's mechanical crack. No impact, no echo, just swallowed. The sheriff began to blur. Tom saw it immediately. His outline softened, edges compressing inward. "Move!" Tom shouted. The sheriff tried. He stepped backward, but the ground beneath him had less depth than it had seconds before. His body narrowed, not flattened violently, reduced. His uniform wrinkled unnaturally as his volume decreased. "Help me!" he gasped. Tom lunged forward. Caleb grabbed him. "Dad, no!" The sheriff's torso compressed vertically. his arms folded inward against his sides, not broken, not twisted, just occupying less space. His scream cut short, not by injury, by absence of air volume in his lungs. Within seconds, he was gone. No blood, no debris, just empty space where he had stood. The seam pulsed once, satisfied, and narrowed slightly. The trooper fell to his knees. Oh my God! Tom felt ice flood his veins. It wasn't killing. It was reducing, eliminating three-dimensional mass. The sheriff hadn't been destroyed. He had been made less, until nothing remained. The seam turned slightly, toward the truck, toward Caleb. Tom understood instantly.
It targeted enclosed mass first, but once enclosure was gone, it consumed whatever remained within its defined field. The trooper scrambled into his cruiser, reversed frantically. The cruiser's rear half compressed mid-motion, the trunk shortened visibly, metal folding inward silently. The vehicle shrank like a toy under pressure. The trooper vanished with it. Within seconds, both cruiser and driver were gone. Tom grabbed Caleb, back to the farm. It was instinct, familiar ground. They drove fast. The truck rattled violently as the region compressed. Fields narrowed, tree lines folding inward. The sky looked lower than ever before. When they reached the farm, the barn stood alone in a shrinking yard. The cattle that had run free were gone. Not bodies, gone. The vertical presence on the horizon now loomed massive, defined edges visible. Still not a creature, still not stepping, but clearer than ever. Caleb's voice was barely audible. It's making everything two-dimensional. Tom nodded. Yes. It was collapsing depth, converting volume into surface, flattening reality itself. And they were nearly at the center. The barn groaned softly behind them. The yard measured maybe 20 yards across now. From 2,000 acres to this. Tom looked at his son. Real fear finally settled fully into his face. It's coming for us next. The seam flickered at the edge of the barn wall. Smaller, closer, waiting.
Part 6. When the sky started thinning. By the time the sheriff was gone, the world had lost its depth. Not metaphorically, physically. Tom stood in what remained of his yard, no more than 20 yards across, and stared at a horizon that no longer curved naturally. The distance between him and the vertical distortion had shortened so dramatically that he could now see edges within it. Not limbs, not features, edges. Hard, geometric lines that didn't belong to anything organic. The barn behind them creaked softly. Caleb looked up. Dad, look at the sky. Tom did, and his stomach dropped. The blue above them wasn't uniform anymore. It looked layered, as if depth had been peeled away from it. Clouds appeared flatter, thinner, like projections against a surface too close to be real. The atmosphere felt compressed. Breathing took more effort. Not because of panic, because there was less air volume. Tom felt it with absolute clarity. The entity wasn't just reducing land, it was reducing space itself, and space included the sky. The barn doors burst outward. Not violently, just pushed open by pressure from within. Tom turned. Inside, the aisle was nearly gone. Where there had once been 34 feet, then 18, now there were maybe 6. The back wall hovered inches from the entrance. The entire interior volume had nearly collapsed. Caleb whispered, "It's finishing it." Tom stepped toward the barn cautiously. The seam appeared along the interior wall again, this time spanning nearly the entire height of the structure. The wood didn't crack, didn't splinter. It simply folded inward. The seam pulsed once. The barn compressed. Slowly, steadily. Support beams bent without breaking. Metal hinges flattened without snapping. The roof lowered until it touched the walls. Then the walls folded inward. Within seconds, the barn was gone. No rubble, no debris, just a rectangular imprint in the dirt. The yard felt even wider afterward, not because space had increased, because one more volume had been erased. Caleb's breathing quickened. It's stripping everything away. Tom nodded. It's removing depth. He understood now. This wasn't predation. It wasn't hunger. It was correction. The world, at least this section of it, was being simplified, flattened, as if 3 dimensions were unnecessary, and something older than them had decided to reduce it.
The vertical presence on the horizon was no longer distant. It loomed just beyond what remained of the yard, maybe 200 yards away, but distance was deceptive now. The ground between them felt shallow, like stepping across cardboard laid over nothing. Tom knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. It resisted immediately. There was almost no give, no depth. The earth beneath them was becoming surface. Caleb stared at the impression where the barn had stood. Why here, he asked. Tom's mind raced. This land had been farmed for generations, fenced, sectioned, measured, mapped, defined, every inch divided into boundaries, property lines, enclosures, structures. Perhaps it had started with that. Maybe defined space created conditions for compression. Maybe the act of enclosing three-dimensional space marked it, designated it, made it reducible. Tom thought of something else. The grain silo north of here, the water tower, all tall vertical structures, defined volume. The entity had not attacked randomly. It had started with enclosed mass. And now, it had almost finished with the largest enclosure of all, the sky. Caleb staggered suddenly. Dad, my ears. Tom felt it too. Pressure building, like descending rapidly in an airplane. The air above them rippled faintly, not visually dramatic, just wrong. The blue thinned further, stars faintly visible in midday. That shouldn't have been possible. The seam appeared in the air, not touching ground, suspended vertically, huge now, wider than the barn had been. The blackness within it churned slowly. Tom forced himself to look inside, and for the first time, he saw more than geometry. He saw plain, endless flat plain, stretching infinitely. No depth, no shadow, no perspective, just surface. And he understood. The entity wasn't coming from somewhere else. It wasn't invading. It was revealing the natural state of reality beyond 3 dimensions, a state without depth, without volume, without interior. This land, this region, was being corrected back to that state. Caleb grabbed his father's arm. What do we do? Tom's mind worked desperately. Every enclosed structure had accelerated compression, but when they had been standing in open yard, it had slowed slightly. Open space resisted, but there was barely any open space left. The yard measured maybe 10 yards now. Beyond that, the distortion stood like a wall.
Then something struck him. When the cattle had run into open field, they had lasted longer. When they stood in the barn, they vanished quickly. Enclosure concentrated reduction. Open expanse diluted it. They needed maximum openness. Not a yard, not a field, something bigger. Tom looked up again, at the thinning sky. He realized the sky was the largest enclosure of all, atmosphere contained by gravity. If that boundary collapsed, there would be nothing left. The seam widened further. The air grew crushing. Caleb dropped to one knee. Tom forced himself upright. "Spread out," he shouted. Caleb looked confused. "Make as much distance between us as possible." They moved to opposite ends of the remaining yard, only 10 yards apart. But it was something. The seam pulsed. The ground beneath Tom's boots flattened further. His shadow sharpened unnaturally, edges too crisp, as if light had less depth to travel through. Caleb's outline flickered. Tom felt a surge of terror, not panic, clarity. It wasn't random. It responded to density. Mass concentrated together was easier to reduce. Spread apart, harder. The seam hesitated, just slightly. The compression slowed. The sky shimmered. Tom shouted across the yard, "Don't come closer." Caleb nodded weakly. The entity adjusted. The vertical plane tilted, recalibrating. Tom realized something horrifying. It was learning, testing boundaries, optimizing reduction. The amp pressure spiked violently. Caleb screamed. His silhouette blurred for a split second, then stabilized. Tom's heart pounded. The seam narrowed slightly, as if reconsidering. Then, the ground beyond the yard collapsed inward. The entire north field compressed in one silent sweep, from hundreds of yards to nothing. The vertical presence now stood directly at the edge of the yard, towering, defined, still not stepping forward, just revealed. The seam hovered inches in front of Tom. He stared into it and saw no hatred, no malice, just inevitability, a plane reclaiming volume. Caleb's voice trembled. "Dad." Tom didn't turn.
He understood now that this was the center, this farm, this coordinate, the origin of reduction, perhaps a fault line in dimensional stability, perhaps something humanity had triggered unknowingly. It didn't matter. The rule was clear. Enclosed space collapses first. Mass accelerates compression. Depth is temporary. The seam widened again.
The yard shrank to 5 yards. Tom felt the ground thin beneath him. He looked up at the sky. It was almost transparent now. Stars visible clearly in full daylight. There was barely any atmosphere left above them. They stood inside a thinning bubble of dimension. Caleb whispered, "It's the sky next." Tom nodded slowly. Yes, and once the sky flattened, there would be no space left anywhere. The seam pulsed. Closer. Caleb took a step toward his father instinctively. "Stay back," Tom shouted. Too late. The moment Caleb reduced the distance between them, the seam surged forward. His son's outline blurred violently. Tom lunged, grabbed Caleb's jacket, pulled him backward with all his strength. The seam recoiled slightly, as if resistance confused it. Tom dragged Caleb to the very edge of the remaining yard. They stood back to back, maximizing outward space, breathing hard. The compression slowed again, barely, but enough to notice. Tom's mind raced. It wasn't unstoppable. It obeyed constraints, not moral ones, spatial ones. If space existed, it had something to compress. If space was undefined, it hesitated. The seam flickered uncertainly. The sky shimmered above, and for the first time since this began, the reduction paused, not reversed, paused. Tom exhaled slowly. "Stay apart," he whispered. The vertical plane loomed inches away, waiting, calculating. The sky above thinned to near transparency, but did not collapse, not yet. They stood on a fragment of three-dimensional ground, surrounded by flattened reality, and the entity hesitated. Part 7, Beyond the Edge. The pause did not feel like mercy. It felt like calculation. Tom stood at the edge of what remained of his farm, 5 yards of ground suspended in a world that no longer had depth. Caleb stood several feet away, both of them deliberately separated, instinctively maintaining distance as if proximity itself were dangerous. The vertical plane loomed inches beyond the yard. It was no longer a distant distortion. It was a boundary. And beyond that boundary, there was no horizon, no field, no sky, just flatness. Tom forced himself to look directly at it. The edge of reality was not jagged, not torn. It was clean, perfectly straight, like a sheet of black glass standing upright. But it wasn't glass. It was absence of dimension. Beyond it, he could see something that made his mind recoil. A world without depth. No shadows. No perspective. Just surface stretching infinitely in all directions. He could see shapes there. Not bodies. Not landscapes. Imprints. Like flattened silhouettes pressed into a plane. Some wide. Some tall. Some irregular. Frozen. Two-dimensional remnants of what had once occupied space. Tom felt nausea rise in his throat. The Johnson farm. The sheriff. The trooper. The cattle. Everything reduced. Was there. Not gone. Not destroyed. Flattened into surface. Caleb's voice trembled. "What is that?" Tom didn't lie. "That's what's left." The seam flickered slightly, as if reacting to their observation. The air between them and the plane thinned further. The sky above was almost gone now. Stars burned cold and sharp in a washed-out daylight. Gravity felt weaker. Sound carried strangely, like it had less room to travel. Tom crouched carefully, picked up a small stone from the remaining yard. He hesitated, then threw it into the plane. The moment the rock crossed the boundary, it didn't fall.
It didn't bounce. It struck the surface and became an imprint. A dark oval pressed flat against the infinite sheet. Caleb gasped. "It's not a void." "No," Tom said quietly. "It's a surface." The entity wasn't consuming space to create nothing. It was converting volume into plane, reducing three-dimensional reality into two. The yard beneath them trembled faintly, not collapsing, adjusting. The pause was ending. Tom felt it. The entity had tested proximity, had tested mass density. Now it was recalibrating. The vertical plane tilted slightly inward.
Closer to the edge of the yard. Caleb took one step backward. The yard compressed immediately, from 5 yards to 4. "Don't move," Tom shouted. Caleb froze. The compression slowed again. Tom's mind raced. It responded to movement, or perhaps to imbalance. When Caleb stepped closer to the boundary, mass distribution shifted, and the entity responded. Tom swallowed hard. "We need to test something." Caleb stared at him in disbelief. "Test what?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the very edge of the yard. The boundary stood inches from his face. He could feel a faint pull, not physical, spatial, like gravity oriented sideways. He extended his hand slowly. Caleb shouted, "Dad, don't." Tom ignored him. His fingertips crossed the boundary. There was no pain, no burning, no tearing, just compression. His fingertips flattened instantly. Not crushed, not injured, reduced. He yanked his hand back. It snapped into 3 dimensions again, but something was wrong. His fingers felt thinner, not visually obvious, but weaker, less substance. Caleb stared in horror. "Your hand!" Tom flexed it. It moved, but the sensation was off, as if some depth had been permanently lost. "It doesn't kill you immediately," Tom said through clenched teeth. "It converts." The plane shimmered faintly, almost impatiently. The yard shrank another inch. The sky above flickered. The last layer of blue peeled back like a fading projection. Now there was nothing above them but faint starlight and blackness. The bubble of 3-dimensional atmosphere was nearly gone. Caleb's breathing grew shallow. "We can't stay here." Tom knew that. But stepping into the plane meant reduction. Staying meant eventual compression. There was no direction left. North was gone. South had collapsed. East and west had flattened. The farm was the last remaining pocket of depth. The origin. The epicenter. Tom's thoughts clicked into place. It started here. Caleb looked at him. "What?" "The compression started here. At the farm." Caleb swallowed. So this might be the only place it hasn't finished." The vertical plane pulsed faintly. Tom looked at the ground beneath their feet. The yard wasn't random. It was centered exactly where the barn and house had once stood. The core of enclosure. The deepest accumulation of defined space. Perhaps that was the anchor. Maybe the entity required a center point.
A coordinate. Tom looked at Caleb. Spread out again. They moved to opposite edges of the remaining yard, now barely 3 yards across. The plane pressed closer. The compression intensified. Tom closed his eyes briefly, trying to think past fear. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't hunting them emotionally. It was executing a function, reducing dimensional excess. So what interrupted it? Mass distribution slowed it. Open space slowed it. Imbalance confused it. What if, instead of resisting, they disrupted the boundary itself? Tom's eyes snapped open. The yard still had one thing left, a boundary, invisible, but defined, the remaining circular pocket of depth. That circle was an enclosure, and the entity responded to enclosures. Tom looked at Caleb urgently. "We break the boundary." "How?" Tom stomped hard into the soil. "Not randomly, in a line." Caleb caught on. They began carving trenches with their boots, dragging lines outward toward the plane, defining irregular shapes, not circles, not rectangles, jagged, uneven, destroying symmetry. The yard trembled violently. The vertical plane flickered, as if struggling to identify the enclosure. The more irregular the shape became, the more unstable the boundary looked. The seam widened suddenly, not in advance, but in distortion, edges warping. The flattened surface rippled. For the first time, the entity reacted unpredictably. Caleb shouted, "It's shaking!" The yard expanded half an inch, then compressed again. Tom kept carving lines, breaking geometric continuity. The plane pulsed erratically. Beyond it, the flattened silhouettes trembled. Some flickered faintly. Tom's heart pounded. It needs clean boundaries.
The more chaotic the edge became, the less stable the plane appeared. The seam fractured slightly, not opening, cracking, like a mirror under stress. The sky flickered violently. Stars vanished and reappeared. The yard lurched sideways, not inward, sideways. Caleb fell. Tom grabbed him. The vertical plane tilted sharply, and for one horrifying second, depth returned. A gust of real wind hit Tom's face. He saw distant fields, a flash of three-dimensional horizon. Then it snapped back. The plane stabilized partially, but not fully. Hairline fractures now ran across its surface. The entity had not expected irregularity. It had processed enclosures, rectangles, fields, barns, property lines.
It did not process chaos well. The yard remained barely 2 yards wide. The sky flickered uncertainly. The plane loomed unstable. Tom's voice was hoarse. It's not unstoppable. Caleb stared at the cracks in the boundary. What if it fixes itself? Tom looked at the fractured surface. It was already beginning to smooth. Slowly, adapting, learning again. The pause had ended. Now, it was recalculating. And next time, it might not hesitate.
Part 8. The Last Yard. The cracks didn't last. Tom saw it happen in real time. The hairline fractures across the vertical plane smoothed out, not slowly, not violently, just efficiently, like liquids settling into a flawless surface. The brief distortion they had forced into it was already being analyzed, corrected, absorbed. It had learned. The yard beneath them shuddered once more, then shrank. 2 yards became 1.5. The ground did not move inward like sliding earth. It simply contained less distance than it had seconds before. Caleb stood barely 6 feet from his father now. Too close. Tom stepped sideways instinctively, trying to maximize the remaining space. It didn't matter. The compression was no longer hesitating. It was adapting. The vertical plane no longer flickered when they disrupted symmetry. It simply recalculated its edge. The jagged trenches they had carved into the soil were already smoothing out, edges softening, lines straightening, as if reality itself preferred clean geometry. The entity wasn't confused anymore. It was optimizing. The sky above finally gave way. There was no dramatic tear, no explosion, just a soft, almost delicate collapse. The last layer of blue faded completely, replaced by black. Sharp, endless black studded with distant stars. But those stars no longer felt far away. They looked close, pinned to a shallow dome. Tom felt his breath shortened. There was barely any atmosphere left. Sound felt thinner. Even his own voice seemed to travel less distance before fading. Caleb's outline flickered faintly at the edges. Dad. Tom looked at him. His son didn't look injured, but something about him seemed flatter, not visually obvious, but reduced, as if a fraction of depth had been shaved away. The yard shrank again, now maybe 3 feet across. The vertical plane stood inches away on all sides. It wasn't just north anymore. It encircled them, a cylindrical wall of flatness. They were standing inside the last remaining pocket of volume, the epicenter, the final bubble of three-dimensional space. Tom understood now. This wasn't random geography. The reduction radiated outward from this coordinate. The farm hadn't been chosen by accident. It had been the anchor, perhaps the first enclosure ever placed here generations ago, the first fence post driven into ground, the first defined boundary carved into open land. Something about that act
had marked this location, and now the mark was being erased. The plane moved inward slowly, not surging, not rushing, just inevitable. The yard shrank to 2 feet. Tom and Caleb were forced nearly shoulder to shoulder. The moment their bodies touched, the compression intensified. Caleb gasped sharply. His jacket sleeve thinned visibly for half a second before stabilizing. Tom shoved him gently away. Don't touch. They stood as far apart as possible within 2 feet of space. The plane rippled, testing. Tom looked beyond it again. He could see more clearly now. The
The flattened world stretched infinitely. Imprints of farms, vehicles, silos pressed into endless surface. And among them, two elongated shapes side by side, likely the sheriff's cruiser and the trooper. Still, frozen, not destroyed, converted. Caleb whispered, "Are they alive?" Tom didn't know, but he suspected consciousness required depth, and depth was gone there. The yard shrank to 18 inches. Their breathing felt restricted, not from panic, from physics. There was less room for lungs to expand, less space for air molecules to exist. The plane pulsed, edges sharp, ready. Tom's mind raced. Irregular boundaries no longer worked. Distance no longer worked. Open sky was gone. There was nothing left to manipulate externally. Only one variable remained: mass. The entity accelerated compression when mass concentrated. It slowed when mass distributed. But they were at minimum distribution already. Unless there was only one mass left. Tom's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The yard shrank to 12 inches. They were nearly chest to chest. Caleb's eyes filled with realization. No, Tom swallowed. It responds to density. Caleb shook his head. No. If there's only one of us in the bubble, no. The plane edged closer. Their shoulders brushed. The compression spiked violently. Caleb's outline blurred again, longer this time. Tom grabbed him hard. "I'm not saying I'm leaving you." But he was thinking it. The math was simple. Two masses accelerated reduction. One might delay it, not stop, delay. Long enough for what? There was nowhere to go, nowhere left. The yard shrank to 10 inches. Their boots touched. The ground beneath them felt like solid metal now. No give, no soil, pure surface. The plane leaned inward. I felt the pull against my chest. Caleb's voice broke. "Dad."
If one of us steps through... Tom closed his eyes briefly. If one of them entered the plane willingly, the remaining bubble might expand slightly, rebalance, delay collapse. The entity did not target intention, only volume. The sacrifice wouldn't stop it, but it might buy seconds, or minutes. Tom opened his eyes. He saw fear in Caleb's face, but also understanding. "No," Tom said firmly. Caleb swallowed. "It's either both of us flatten or one." The plane surged forward half an inch. The yard shrank to 6 inches. There was no room to move, no room to breathe deeply. Tom made a decision then that felt less like courage and more like inevitability. He shoved Caleb backward, hard. Caleb stumbled and fell through the boundary. For a split second, Tom saw it happen. Caleb's body did not tear, did not collapse violently. He struck the plane and became imprint, flattened silhouette pressed into the infinite surface, frozen mid-fall. The yard expanded instantly from 6 inches to 2 feet. The compression slowed dramatically. The plane stabilized. Tom staggered backward, gasping. Air rushed in, thin but present. The bubble of space had grown. Not large, but survivable. The entity had recalibrated to single mass. Tom stared at the flattened imprint of his son beyond the boundary. Perfect outline, preserved, two-dimensional. His chest tightened painfully. There was no scream, no rage, just a hollow, expanding absence. The vertical plane loomed steady now, not pressing further, not retreating. Balanced. One mass, minimal enclosure, minimal depth. The sky above remained black. The world beyond remained flat, but the bubble held, barely. Tom stood alone in the last pocket of three-dimensional space, breathing shallowly, watching his son exist as surface, and understanding the entity had never intended to eliminate all depth, only excess. And now, there was very little excess left. The plane flickered faintly, almost curious. Tom felt something new then. Not fear, not panic, awareness. The bubble expanded another inch, slightly. The entity was stabilizing around him, not collapsing further, not yet. As if one human-sized volume was acceptable deviation. Anything more was inefficiency. Tom looked at Caleb's imprint again. There was no movement, no sign of life, but there was form, and form meant structure, and structure meant information.
Tom's mind sparked with a fragile possibility. If the flattened world preserved shape, perhaps it preserved more than that. The plane shimmered softly, the bubble trembled, and far out across the endless flat surface, he thought he saw something shift.
Not rise, not stand, but ripple, as if flattened forms were not entirely inert. Tom took one cautious step closer to the boundary. The bubble shrank slightly in warning. He stopped. The rule was clear. One mass, minimal movement, minimal enclosure, minimal depth. The entity tolerated that, nothing more. Tom stood alone in the final yard, balanced on the edge of flatness, watching the infinite plane that had once been his world. And the thing, the correcting force, waited.
Part 9. The Plane That Remembers. The bubble held. Barely. Tom stood in a circular pocket of three-dimensional space no wider than a small bedroom. The vertical plane surrounded him on all sides, smooth and absolute, an infinite wall of flattened existence stretching beyond sight. Above him, there was no sky anymore. Only blackness, with shallow stars embedded like pins in metal. He breathed carefully. Slow. Measured. He had learned the rule. One mass, minimal motion, no enclosure. The entity tolerated that configuration. For now. Beyond the boundary, Caleb's imprint remained. A perfect silhouette pressed into the endless surface. Mid-fall. Frozen. But the longer Tom stared at it, the less frozen it seemed. At first, he thought it was grief distorting perception. Then he saw it clearly. A ripple. Subtle. Moving across the plane. Not outward. Sideways. The flattened world was not static. It flowed. Infinitesimally. Like tectonic plates made of shadow. Tom stepped closer to the boundary. The bubble shrank half an inch. He stopped immediately. The pressure stabilized. He extended his hand slowly. Not through the boundary. Just near it. His fingers tingled faintly. Like static electricity. "Caleb," he whispered. The sound felt strange in the thin air. It didn't travel far. It seemed absorbed almost instantly. But the plane reacted. Not violently. Not dramatically. A faint vibration passed across Caleb's silhouette. Tom's heart pounded. He tried again. "Caleb." The imprint shimmered. The surface around it rippled outward in concentric distortions. Not from the entity. From within the plane itself. Tom's breath caught. Consciousness. If depth was required for movement, perhaps information didn't need it. Perhaps memory didn't need it. The flattened forms might not be dead. They might be compressed. He leaned closer. The bubble tightened in warning. He stopped. He couldn't cross. But maybe he didn't have to. He crouched carefully and picked up a handful of dirt from the ground beneath him. It felt wrong. Grainy but shallow. He tossed the dirt toward Caleb's imprint. The particles struck the plane and flattened instantly into tiny specks. But when they touched Caleb's silhouette, the imprint flickered. Brighter. Defined. The ripple intensified. Tom's pulse raced. The entity pulsed once around him. A warning. He froze. The bubble stabilized again.
It tolerated minimal interaction, but only just.
Tom's mind raced. If the plane preserved information, if flattened beings retained some form of awareness, then the entity was not exterminating reality. It was compressing it into another state, a lower dimensional state. He looked across the infinite surface. Hundreds of imprints stretched into the distance. Farms, vehicles, buildings, human shapes, some large, some small, all pressed into endless plain. And now, several of them flickered faintly, not randomly, in response to him. Tom felt a cold realization settle into his bones. The plane was not empty. It was populated by consciousness that could not move in 3 dimensions, but could ripple in 2. He swallowed hard. "What are you?" he whispered. The vertical boundary around him shimmered softly, as if acknowledging the question. Then, for the first time, it changed. The smooth surface developed faint lines, intersecting geometries. A grid. Subtle, barely visible, like mathematical structure revealed beneath paint. Tom stared in awe. This wasn't a monster. It was a correction protocol, a dimensional rebalancing mechanism, perhaps older than humanity, perhaps older than Earth. The grid pulsed, and a pattern emerged within it. A wave of compression began forming at the far edges of the plane, moving inward, toward him. Slowly, deliberately. Tom's breath caught. The bubble trembled slightly. The entity had tolerated one mass, but now it was finishing its work. The way approached across the flattened surface. As it passed over imprints, they thinned further. Not erased, refined, simplified. Even in 2 dimensions, there was excess. The correction was not done. Tom understood with sick clarity. The plane was only an intermediate state. If 3 dimensions could be reduced to 2, 2 could be reduced to 1. A line. Then a point. Then nothing. The entity wasn't just flattening, it was minimizing, eliminating dimensional complexity step by step. And he was the last remaining 3-dimensional anomaly. The wave reached the edge of the boundary. The bubble tightened violently, shrinking to barely 3 feet across. Tom staggered. The pressure returned. Not as intense as before, but rising. He looked at Caleb's imprint. It flickered desperately now, rippling, responding. The flattened forms around it pulsed as well. The plane wasn't passive.
It was reacting to the wave, resisting. Tom felt it clearly. The compressed consciousness within the surface did not want further reduction. The wave pressed against the boundary again. The bubble shrunk another inch. Tom's lungs strained. The air thinned further. The grid lines across the plane glowed faintly, the correction protocol accelerating. Tom's mind raced for one final variable, what had interrupted it before. Irregularity. Mass imbalance. Chaos. Not geometric disruption, but informational disruption. The flattened world preserved information. If enough of it fluctuated, perhaps the grid would destabilize. Tom stepped as close as he dared to the boundary. The bubble screamed in silent pressure. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. Pain shot through his arm, not physical pain, dimensional strain. His hand flattened slightly before snapping back. But the contact triggered something. The entire plane rippled outward violently. Every imprint flickered, every silhouette shimmered. The wave hesitated, the grid fractured faintly. Tom shouted, voice cracking in thin air. "Move!" The word felt absurd, but the plane responded. Ripples cascaded across its surface, flattened shapes shifted sideways by millimeters, a tidal movement of 2-dimensional existence. The correction wave faltered, the grid lines flickered erratically, the bubble expanded half a foot. Tom collapsed to his knees, the pressure eased slightly. The flattened world was not powerless, it retained collective structure. When agitated, it disrupted the correction process. The wave retreated inches, not gone, but slowed. Tom's chest heaved, he stared at Caleb's imprint. It shimmered faintly, as if aware. The entity's boundary glowed brighter, recalculating. The wave began forming again, stronger. The correction would not stop, only delay. Tom understood the final truth then. This was not personal, not revenge, not invasion. Reality had excess dimensional complexity, and something, some ancient balancing force,
was simplifying it, step by step, 3 to 2, 2 to 1, 1 to 0. He was the final irregularity, the last volume left, and the protocol demanded completion. The wave surged forward again, stronger this time. The bubble shrunk violently, 2 feet, 1.5. Tom stood slowly, calm now, terribly calm. If he remained, the correction would continue. If he crossed,
The bubble would collapse instantly, and the plane would proceed to the next reduction stage, perhaps faster. But if he stayed, he could disrupt it again. Briefly. He looked at Caleb one last time. The imprint shimmered. Tom stepped back from the boundary, spread his arms wide, maximizing irregularity. The bubble trembled violently. The wave crashed against it. The grid fractured more severely. The plane rippled chaotically. All flattened imprints shimmered in unison. The correction stalled again. The entity's surface distorted, not in confusion, in strain. Tom understood what had to happen. One final imbalance. One final disruption. He stepped forward and dove fully into the plane. For a fraction of a second, he experienced it. Depth collapsing, perspective folding, volume flattening into surface. Not pain, not destruction, just reduction. Then, silence. The bubble vanished instantly. No three-dimensional space remained. The correction wave passed across the plane uninterrupted. But something had changed. The entire surface rippled violently. Millions of flattened forms shifted. Not randomly. Together. A collective irregularity spreading across the infinite plane. The grid lines fractured, then shattered. The correction protocol destabilized. Without a stable boundary between dimensions, the reduction halted. The plane trembled and stopped. No further thinning. No conversion to line. No collapse to point. Just infinite two-dimensional existence, filled with preserved form. The entity's presence dissolved. Not defeated. Not destroyed. Balanced. There was no more excess to remove. Three-dimensional volume was gone. The protocol ended. And across the endless flat world, 2 adjacent silhouettes shimmered faintly. Side by side. No depth. No sky. No distance. But not nothing. Not erased. Just different.
Part X. What remains? There was no sky. There was no ground. There was no horizon. There was only surface. Infinite, matte, and silent. The world had no depth anymore. No above, no below, no distance stretching into perspective. Everything existed as adjacency, touching, pressed into the same endless plane. The correction had stopped. Not because it failed, because it finished. Three-dimensional volume had been reduced completely within the affected region. There was nothing left to compress. No more enclosures. No more mass imbalances. No more bubbles of depth. Only plane. And within that plane, information, preserved. Tom did not feel himself arrive. There was no sensation of impact, no falling, no transformation in the way a body understands change. There was only awareness, not located behind eyes, not seated in a chest. Awareness distributed across outline. He did not see in the traditional sense. He perceived adjacency, shapes beside him, contours touching his own, edges aligning. He was shape, and the shape was him. There was no breath, no heartbeat, no internal organs. Those required volume. What remained was structure, pattern, memory mapped into form. He understood that instantly, not through thought, through configuration.
Beside him, another shape shimmered faintly. Caleb, not as a body, as silhouette, but within that silhouette, flicker, recognition. The two shapes touched along a thin boundary line, and in that contact, information transferred. Not words, not sound, memory. Tom perceived his son's awareness. Compressed, yes, but present. Fear was gone. Pain had never existed in this state. There was only continuation. Across the infinite plane, countless other imprints shimmered faintly, some more stable, some fading, some pulsing in slow, rhythmic patterns. The Johnson farm existed here as layered outlines. The sheriff's cruiser lay flattened miles away, distance now meaningless, but still arranged relationally across the plain, all preserved, all simplified. The grid that had once overlaid the surface was gone. The correction protocol had withdrawn. No more waves of reduction, no further collapse. This was equilibrium. Time functioned differently. Without depth, there was no forward motion in the traditional sense. Change occurred as fluctuation in pattern. Ripples moved sideways across the plane. When many imprints shifted together, waves formed.
When isolated forms remained static too long, they faded slightly, information dispersing into neighboring shapes. Tom understood something profound then. Three-dimensional existence had required constant separation, distance, isolation, enclosure. In 2 dimensions, everything touched something. There were no hidden corners, no interiors, no walls. Consciousness here was shared along edges. Privacy did not exist. Neither did loneliness. The plane did not erase identity. It redistributed it. Caleb's shape pressed gently against Tom's. Memory flowed between them. Moments from childhood. The barn. The truck ride. The final shove. All preserved, but without regret. Regret required time moving forward. Here, events existed as fixed configurations. They did not replay. They simply were. Across the infinite surface, other shapes began to shimmer more strongly. A flattened water tower pulsed faintly. A farmhouse outline flickered in response. Clusters formed, imprints aligning along edges, forming larger composite structures. 2-dimensional ecosystems emerging. Not built, not constructed, just reorganized. The correction had not ended reality. It had changed its dimensional rule set. Where once there was vertical growth, now there was lateral expansion. Tom sensed something else. At the farthest reach of adjacency, the boundary of the correction zone. Beyond that boundary, there was still depth, still sky, still volume. The reduction had not consumed the entire planet. Only this region, this marked coordinate. The farm had been epicenter, but not the whole world. Beyond the flattened boundary, 3-dimensional reality continued, unaware, intact. The correction had been localized, a balancing event, not total annihilation. Tom understood the scale now. Dimensional correction occurred where excess accumulated, where enclosure defined too much complexity, where volume grew unstable. The farm had been saturated with boundaries, fences upon fences, structures upon structures, centuries of measured land. Perhaps that density had triggered the protocol, or perhaps something deeper beneath the soil had. It no longer mattered. The process was complete. A ripple passed across the plane, soft, measured, not destructive. The presence of the correcting force brushed the surface one last time, not as seam, not as vertical plane, as diffuse alignment, ensuring stability. Tom did not feel fear.
He felt recognition. The force was not sentient in the way humans define sentience. It was structural, a law of reality expressing itself. When dimensional strain exceeded threshold, reduction occurred, then equilibrium, then silence. The ripple passed and did not return. Without further compression, the flattened world began adapting. Imprints rearranged slightly over what might once have been hours or years.
Time was not measurable here in the same way. Clusters of forms aligned into networks. Touching edges formed communication chains. Shared awareness expanded laterally, not merging into uniformity, but harmonizing. Individual silhouettes retained distinct contours. Tom remained Tom. Caleb remained Caleb, but their edges interlocked with others. Memory extended sideways infinitely. Knowledge distributed across adjacency. There was no hunger, no cold, no decay, only configuration and the constant presence of infinite surface. At what would have once been might, though darkness no longer changed, the stars beyond the flattened boundary shimmered faintly. Three-dimensional light continued traveling through space outside this region. Occasionally, that light intersected the boundary. Where it did, the plane glowed faintly. Information from outside leaked in as thin bands of brightness, not enough to restore depth, but enough to indicate continuity. The universe beyond still expanded, still lived, still moved. This region simply existed differently now. Corrected, simplified, stable. Tom perceived something at the very center of the flattened zone. The original coordinate, where the barn once stood, where the first fence had been driven. There remained a faint indentation in the plane, not vertical, not dimensional, just a scar of origin. The site where 3 became 2. It did not pulse, did not threaten. It was a memory etched into surface. The event would not repeat here. There was no excess left. Caleb's silhouette shifted slightly against Tom's, a subtle alignment, a form of two-dimensional embrace. And in that contact, Tom understood the final truth. Nothing had been destroyed, only transformed. Three-dimensional beings feared flattening because they equated depth with existence. But existence did not require depth. It required pattern, and pattern persisted. Across the infinite surface, countless preserved forms shimmered softly, a silent civilization of outlines, stable,
Enduring, unchanging. The thing in the cattle farm had not been a monster. It had been a correction. And now, there was nothing left to correct. Beyond the flattened boundary, somewhere in untouched Kansas farmland, cattle still grazed under open sky. Fences still divided land. Barns still enclosed volume. People still built walls and called them property. And one day, perhaps, if dimensional strain gathered again, another seam might appear, another region might thin, another correction might unfold. But not here. Here, the plane remains silent, infinite, complete. Two adjacent silhouettes shimmered softly in permanent contact. No breath, no shadow, no distance, just surface, and the quiet persistence of form.